When I saw my husband scrolling through my phone, my heart didn't skip a beat out of fear, at least, not the kind I expected. It was the realization that he might see those messages. The ones I never meant to keep. The ones I should have deleted but didn't. I lunged forward to snatch it back, but he pulled away, holding it just out of reach as his eyes moved line by line, deeper into the truth I'd buried. I watched his face transform, confusion, then hurt, then something colder, until it looked nothing like the man I married. I knew what he was about to find. The message. The one that could ruin everything or maybe, somehow, make it make sense. Then, just as his thumb hovered to swipe again, my phone buzzed in his hand. A new notification. I saw his face drain of color when he read the name on the screen. He froze. Didn't even blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, an old habit when I panic, and all I could hear was the sound of his breathing, shallow and quick, across the room. That was the moment. The one I feared for weeks. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake. One that rewrote everything. And now I had no choice but to tell you how it all happened. But before I reveal the secret I tried so hard to hide, leave a comment below with the city you're watching from, and tell me, have you ever kept a secret so tightly, only for it to shatter right in front of you? Grief is quiet. It doesn't slam the doors or wail through the halls. It sits beside you in the kitchen while you boil water you won't drink. It follows you through the house in silence, pressing down on your shoulders when no one's around to see how tired you really are. That's how it was for me after he died. Days bled into nights. I ate when I remembered. I slept when the guilt allowed. And even then, it wasn't rest. It was a temporary escape. I moved through my home like a ghost trapped in a body that still looked alive. I never changed a thing. His keys still hung by the door. His shoes waited by the mat, like he might need them. I couldn't bring myself to move them. Every drawer I opened was a trigger, every smell, every shadow in the hall. People said it would get easier. I don't think they meant it. Our son called less and less. I never blamed him. Grief makes people uncomfortable. And he was grieving too. Just in a different way. He was trying to move on. I wasn't. Then one Thursday afternoon, as I was trimming the lavender by the back fence, I heard the front gate creak open. At first, I thought it was the mailman. Or maybe the neighbor. But when I walked around the house and saw who stood there, my breath caught. It was him. My husband's best friend. They'd known each other since college. I hadn't seen him in months, not since the funeral. He stood there with a bottle of wine in one hand and a hesitant smile. I was nearby, he said, as if it explained everything. Thought I'd check in. Something in me shifted. Maybe it was the way he looked at me, not with pity, but with familiarity. Like I was still me. Not the widow everyone tiptoed around. Not the woman too fragile to face daylight. Just me. I invited him in without thinking. The house felt different with another heartbeat in it. I offered him tea. He declined and held up the wine. It's dry, he said. But not terrible. We sat in the living room, glasses half full. He asked about the garden, about my son, about the repairs that still hadn't been made. I found myself talking more than I had in weeks. He listened, not with the patience of someone enduring a sad story, but with interest. Real interest. And when I laughed at something he said, it startled me. It wasn't forced. It was mine. We didn't talk about my husband. Not directly. But he was there. In the way we paused before saying his name. In the glances we exchanged when the house creaked the way it used to when he walked through the hallway. At one point, he got up to look at a painting that still hung in the hall. One my husband hated, but I'd always loved. I followed him, wineglass in hand. He stood close. Too close, maybe. But I didn't move away. I always thought this one looked like you, he said, nodding at the brush strokes. Strong. Quiet. But if you look long enough, it says more than you'd think. I didn't answer. I didn't know how to. Eventually, he left. No hug. No awkward goodbye. Just a soft take care, okay, and the click of the door behind him. But something lingered after he was gone. Something warm and cold at once. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was haunted. But because I wasn't. For the first time in months, my mind didn't loop memories like a film reel. Instead, it played a new scene. The sound of his voice. The way he'd looked at me, not with sorrow, but attention. Maybe even something more. I hated myself for thinking it. And yet. I didn't. The next day, I replayed the visit in my mind 100 times. Every smile. Every glance. Every pause. I told myself it meant nothing. That grief makes us cling to anything that feels like life. But another part of me, one I hadn't listened to in years, whispered that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't dead inside after all. A week passed. No word from him. I told myself that was good. That it ended where it needed to. But then I saw his name light up on my phone. A text. Simple. Casual. Doing okay? I stared at it for a long time. Then I replied, trying. He sent back, mind some company again? And just like that, the house felt smaller. The air heavier. My hands trembled, not with dread, but with anticipation. I wasn't ready. Not for what came next. Not for the choices I'd make. But I opened the door anyway. Because part of me, maybe the worst part, maybe the truest, wanted to feel again. Even if it meant crossing lines I thought I never would. I didn't expect to hear from him again so soon. I told myself that what happened that day was a fluke, a passing moment, the kind grief tricks you into believing is something more. But 2 days after he texted, he pulled into my driveway again, same easy smile, same bottle of wine in hand. He didn't knock. He stood at the porch, waiting, as if he knew I'd already seen him from the window and just hadn't decided yet whether to open the door. I hesitated. Not because I didn't want to see him. But because I did. And that truth was starting to worry me. It's funny how you can live decades thinking you know yourself, your boundaries, your beliefs, your loyalty, and then one look, one unexpected visit, makes you realize you're far more fragile than you thought. Still, I opened the door. I even smiled. I asked if he wanted to sit outside, and he said yes. We settled on the patio, the evening sun casting long shadows across the wooden deck. The air was still warm, and the scent of rosemary from the garden carried on the breeze. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, it buzzed with a kind of energy I couldn't explain. He poured the wine without asking. His movements were relaxed, practiced. Like this wasn't a strange situation at all. Like he'd done this 100 times. We didn't speak much at first. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, though. It had weight, like a conversation happening underneath the surface. Eventually, he asked how I'd been. I gave the usual answer, some days are easier than others. He nodded and didn't press. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. You know, I always admired how you handled everything. After the funeral, I mean. I looked at him, unsure whether to thank him or correct him. Because the truth was, I hadn't handled anything. I'd just endured it. Survived it. I didn't really handle it, I said quietly. I just kept going. He tilted his head, eyes narrowing slightly like he saw more in my answer than I meant to reveal. Sometimes that's harder. There was a pause. I sipped the wine. It was dry, like he said, but not terrible. He leaned back in his chair and stretched out his legs, his gaze wandering across the yard. "You've changed," he said suddenly. I stiffened. "How so?" "You seem—" "I don't know." "Less guarded." "Softer, maybe." I didn't know what to make of that. Was it a compliment? A warning? "You think that's a good thing?" I asked. "I think it means you're letting yourself feel again." The words struck something deep. I hadn't realized how numb I'd become until he said it. Grief has a way of freezing you in place, encasing you in habits and routines that keep you from crumbling. But lately, I'd started noticing small shifts. The taste of tea in the morning. The color of the sky at dusk. The way his voice made me feel less alone. That was the scariest part. I changed the subject. Asked about his work, his life. He gave vague answers. Said he was doing all right, keeping busy. But his tone didn't match the words. There was something unsaid lingering between us, and it thickened the longer we avoided it. When I stood up to refill our glasses, he followed me into the kitchen. I felt his presence behind me, close but not touching. I poured the wine slowly, suddenly aware of how quiet the house was. "I missed this," he said softly. I turned to look at him. "Missed what?" "This. Talking. Being here." The way he said it, it wasn't casual. It was deliberate. Weighted. And it made my heart beat faster, not from fear, but from recognition. I knew that feeling. I'd had it before. A long time ago. But it had been buried for so long I'd forgotten how quickly it could come back. He stepped closer. His hand brushed mine as I handed him the glass. Neither of us moved away. My breath caught. His eyes locked on mine, searching for something. Maybe permission. Maybe courage. And then, we kissed. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't rough or frantic. It was quiet. Careful. Like we were both testing the ground beneath us to see if it would hold. But once it started, the silence between us cracked open, and everything we hadn't said poured out through that one fragile connection. When we pulled away, I didn't speak. Neither did he. The moment had passed, but the weight of it remained, like a shadow that stretched across the room. He left not long after. No excuses. No promises. Just a lingering look as he walked out the door, like he knew something had shifted. And I knew it too. That night, I couldn't sleep again. But this time, it wasn't because of grief. It was because I'd crossed a line. And the terrifying part wasn't that I'd done it, it was how easy it had been. How natural. Like I'd been waiting for it, whether I wanted to admit it or not. I thought about telling someone. A friend. My sister. Even my son. But the words wouldn't come. How do you explain a moment like that? How do you justify it when there's no excuse except loneliness and longing? I sat in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the kiss over and over in my mind. Not just the sensation of it, but what it meant. It wasn't just attraction. It wasn't just comfort. It was something deeper, more dangerous. It meant I wasn't done feeling. And that scared me more than anything. The morning after that kiss, I went about my usual routine as if nothing had happened. I made coffee, opened the windows, and fed the cat, who'd been my only consistent companion in the house for months. But underneath the movements, under the clinking of the spoon against the mug and the familiar creak of the floorboards, was a current I couldn't ignore. Something had changed. I had changed. And trying to behave as though everything was the same only made the difference more obvious. I didn't hear from him for several days. At first, I felt relief. Then disappointment. Then irritation at myself for feeling either. I checked my phone more than I should have. Each time it was someone else, or worse, nothing. I had no right to expect anything from him, I told myself. It had been a moment. A mistake, even, depending on how I wanted to frame it. But the silence left too much room for my mind to wander, and that, I was learning, could be more dangerous than any action. By the fourth day, I began talking myself into moving on. I folded laundry with more intention, cleaned the corners of the house I'd long ignored, and made a list of things to fix before winter. It felt like forward motion, even if my thoughts lagged behind. I told myself I was better off keeping things uncomplicated. Letting the past stay in the past, and the future, whatever it might be, come in its own time. That's why, when I saw his car parked near the edge of the supermarket lot, a chill ran through me. He wasn't looking for me. Couldn't have been. It was coincidence. But then he looked up from his phone and saw me, and there was no hesitation. He smiled and started walking toward me like he'd been waiting. I considered turning away, pretending I hadn't noticed. But my feet stayed still. My breath caught in my throat, and all I could do was wait. "You look good," he said casually, like it hadn't been days of silence between us. I gave him a tight smile, not trusting my voice. He offered to help with my bags, and I let him, partly because they were heavier than I anticipated and partly because I didn't want to make a scene in the parking lot. We walked in silence to my car, the autumn breeze pulling at the hem of my coat. When we reached the trunk, I opened it and stepped aside. He loaded the groceries with practiced ease, then closed it gently and leaned against the car. His expression had shifted, something quieter now. Thoughtful. "Do you regret it?" he asked suddenly, eyes fixed on the ground. I froze. I knew what he meant. And I also knew the answer wasn't as simple as yes or no. "I don't know what to call it," I replied, carefully. "But I haven't stopped thinking about it." He nodded, as if that answer, ambiguous as it was, confirmed something he'd already suspected. There was a long pause, one that would have been awkward with anyone else. Then he said, "I'm going to the lake house this weekend. Just to clear my head. Thought I might take a few tools up there, fix the back deck. You remember how it creaks when it rains?" I did. My husband used to complain about it every spring. "I thought maybe you'd want to come," he added, finally looking at me. My stomach twisted. The offer sounded simple, but we both knew it wasn't. Nothing about us was simple anymore. And I had no idea if I wanted to untangle what had already begun to knot. "I'll think about it," I said quietly. He smiled then. Not the confident, teasing smile he usually wore. This one was different. Smaller. Almost hesitant. He nodded, stepped back, and walked away without waiting for more. That night, I stood in my bedroom staring at my overnight bag. I hadn't packed it, but I kept imagining what I would put inside if I did. A sweater in case it got cold. Comfortable shoes. A book I probably wouldn't read. I didn't want to read. I wanted to stop thinking. To stop analyzing every feeling as if naming them would make them less dangerous. Instead, I wandered the house, touching things I hadn't touched in months. My husband's old records. The jar of buttons he'd kept on his workbench. The faded photograph of us on the day we moved in. We'd been so young. So full of plans. But plans had a way of shifting. Of folding under time and circumstance until you no longer recognized what they'd once meant. The woman in that photo wasn't me anymore. She was a version of me who still believed certain things would last forever. That love, once chosen, stayed whole and untouched. The next morning, I texted him. Just one word. Yes. He didn't reply right away. Hours passed. I made soup. Trimmed the dead stems off my gardenias. Reorganized the hall closet. All the while wondering if he'd changed his mind. Then, just as I was about to put my phone down for good, it buzzed. Pick you up Friday. Noon. I stared at the message. It felt final in a way I hadn't expected. As if the decision, once made, couldn't be unmade. And maybe that was true. Maybe, by agreeing, I had already stepped too far over the edge to walk it back. But I didn't delete the message. I didn't text back with second thoughts. I simply set the phone on the table and went upstairs to look for that old overnight bag. The one I hadn't used since before everything fell apart. It was time to see what else I had left inside me. The day he picked me up, the weather was indecisive, gray clouds drifting across a pale sky, sunlight breaking through in flickers, like it couldn't decide whether to retreat or hold its ground. I felt much the same. I had packed my bag with care but also with hesitation, unsure of what this weekend would be, what I was walking toward, or what I might be walking away from. When his car pulled into the driveway, I stood at the window longer than necessary. It was an old habit I'd picked up after my husband's death, watching cars arrive, even if I already knew who was inside, as if the extra moment would prepare me. It never did. He didn't get out right away. He stayed in the driver's seat with the engine running, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel like he was trying to steady himself. I understood the feeling. This wasn't just a weekend away. This was something else, something unnamed but fully formed, waiting in the silence between us. I grabbed my bag and stepped outside. The air was cool, scented with damp earth and the fading sweetness of summer grass. He looked up as I approached, and his face softened into something unreadable, part smile, part restraint. He opened the trunk without a word, placed my bag inside, and closed it with a quiet thud. The drive started in silence. The road out of town was familiar, lined with the same trees that had turned golden every autumn of my adult life. But nothing about this drive felt routine. We didn't make small talk. We didn't touch the radio. It was the kind of silence that wasn't empty but full of questions, of memories, of things we weren't ready to say yet. About 40 minutes in, he finally spoke. I used to come up here with him, you know. Your husband. I nodded, my fingers tightening slightly on the hem of my sleeve. We'd talk about the future. What we'd build. What we'd leave behind. He always thought you'd outlive us both. I turned to look at him, surprised by the honesty of that sentence. He said that? All the time, he replied, eyes still on the road. Said you were too stubborn to go first. A smile tugged at my mouth despite the heaviness in my chest. It was true. I had always been the one to push forward, to hold things together, even when I was unraveling inside. The rest of the drive passed with sporadic conversation, nothing deep, just enough to make the quiet feel chosen rather than imposed. When we arrived at the lake house, the first thing I noticed was how much had stayed the same. The siding needed paint, the porch creaked underfoot, and the dock sagged slightly at the edge, but it was all familiar. Worn, but not forgotten. Inside, the house smelled of cedar and dust. He opened windows while I stood in the middle of the living room, letting the stillness settle over me. There were photos on the walls, some of them with my husband, some of them older, from years I hadn't shared with them. It felt like walking into someone else's memory. I'll take the back room, he said. You can have the one upstairs. I nodded, grateful for the space, even if we both knew it didn't change the direction things had already taken. We spent the afternoon working on the deck. He handed me nails and instructions, and I followed them without question. It was easier than thinking. Easier than letting my mind spiral into what-if scenarios. We worked in rhythm, not quite synchronized, but close enough to feel the pull of familiarity. At one point, he paused, sweat dampening the collar of his shirt, and looked at me with something between nostalgia and longing. "You were always the quiet one," he said. I was trying not to interrupt, I replied. He laughed, and it broke something open between us. For a moment, we were just two people, tired and sunlit, surrounded by old wood and the scent of pine. For a moment, it didn't feel complicated. That night, after dinner, we sat on the porch with mugs of tea. The lake was still, a dark mirror catching pieces of the moon. We didn't talk much. Just sat. Side by side. The air between us carried all the words we didn't say, and maybe that was enough. At one point, he reached over, not suddenly, not boldly, and placed his hand on top of mine. I didn't move. I didn't pull away. But I didn't move closer either. It was enough just to feel warmth again. To feel wanted. Seen. Not as a widow. Not as a shadow of who I used to be. But as someone still alive, still capable of feeling. Later, when we said goodnight, I climbed the stairs slowly. My body ached from the day's work, but it was a good kind of ache, earned, grounding. In the small bedroom, I opened the window and let the breeze in. The sheets smelled faintly of lavender and something older, time, maybe. I lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks of the house settling into itself. I thought about how easily lines blur. How quickly companionship can turn into something more, and how something more can slip into the space where grief used to live. I didn't know what would happen next. I wasn't sure I wanted to. But I knew I had crossed a threshold. And once crossed, it's almost impossible to go back. The morning sunlight filtered through thin curtains, casting soft shapes on the wooden floor. I woke up before I needed to, my body tuned to a rhythm I couldn't shut off. The house was still. I could hear the distant lap of water against the dock and the faint chirping of birds that always seemed to come alive just before dawn. For a while, I lay motionless, eyes open, listening. There was something about waking up in an unfamiliar bed that always made me feel more exposed. Even if the place was safe. Even if I was technically alone. My mind retraced every step of the day before, the drive, the conversation, the silence on the porch, the way his hand had lingered on mine. I hadn't pulled away, and I hadn't leaned in. But the weight of that small gesture had stayed with me through the night. I got dressed slowly, choosing jeans and an old sweater. The kind of outfit that said I was here to help, not to feel. As I descended the stairs, I could smell coffee already brewing, mixed with the scent of toast and the faint earthiness of damp wood. He was in the kitchen, his back to me, humming something low and tuneless. When he turned and saw me, he didn't greet me with words. He just handed me a mug, warm and full, and we stood in silence while we sipped. Eventually, he broke it. "You slept okay?" I nodded. Better than I expected. There wasn't much more to say. Breakfast was simple. We sat at the small table, each lost in our own thoughts, and it was a relief not to fill the quiet with false energy. The tension between us hadn't disappeared, it had settled into something steadier. Not quite comfort, but no longer uncertainty either. After breakfast, we returned to the deck. The repairs were mostly done, but he wanted to reinforce a few planks near the steps. I helped where I could, holding boards in place, passing nails, steadying beams. It felt good to be useful, to work with my hands, to do something that had a beginning and an end. Around noon, he wiped his brow and stretched, looking out at the lake. "I forgot how peaceful it is out here." I nodded in agreement, though my gaze was fixed on the horizon. The water had always had that effect on me, pulling my thoughts out of my chest and scattering them across the ripples. We spent the afternoon cleaning out the old shed behind the house. It hadn't been touched in years. Dust covered every surface, and the air inside was thick with forgotten things. We found boxes of tools, faded tackle gear, and a pair of hiking boots that once belonged to my husband. I held them in my hands longer than I should have, running my thumb along the worn leather. He didn't say anything. Just watched. I appreciated that more than he knew. By the time we finished, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. We washed up and decided to take a walk down by the dock. The lake was glass-like, reflecting the streaks of orange and gold in the sky. The air had cooled, and I folded my arms across my chest as we walked side by side. He didn't speak for a long time, and neither did I. But then he stopped, hands in his pockets, and turned toward me. "I keep thinking about that day," he said. "I didn't have to ask which one. I don't want to ruin anything," he added. "But I can't pretend like it didn't happen." I stood there, heart heavy but steady. "I'm not pretending." His eyes searched mine, and I could feel the question rising in the silence between us. Not spoken aloud, but present in every breath, every glance. I stepped closer. "Not much. Just enough." We kissed. The words felt strange out loud. Simple, factual. But they carried more weight than I expected. His jaw tightened slightly, like he was bracing for something. "I know," he said. "I haven't stopped thinking about it." There was no rush after that. We didn't embrace. We didn't step further into the moment. We just stood there, the wind moving softly around us, the dock creaking beneath our feet. Later, back at the house, we made dinner without fanfare. I chopped vegetables while he stirred sauce. It was domestic in a way that made my chest ache. It reminded me of the rhythm I used to have with someone else. But it wasn't the same. And maybe that was the most dangerous part, it wasn't supposed to be. We ate quietly. No candles. No music. Just the sound of cutlery on plates and the occasional clink of glasses. The normalcy of it all felt surreal. After dinner, he cleaned up while I sat on the porch, watching the last light fade from the sky. My mind wandered, not to the past, but to the now. To this strange place between grief and want. Between memory and momentum. When he joined me, we didn't speak. His arm brushed mine when he sat, and I didn't move. The air between us had changed again. Something had deepened, but it was still unspoken. A current we both felt but refused to name. When the wind picked up, I shivered. He offered his sweater. I took it. Eventually, I stood. "I think I'll turn in." He nodded, eyes following me as I stepped back into the house and climbed the stairs. In the room, I lay on the bed, still in his sweater, and stared at the ceiling. I wasn't confused. I wasn't even afraid. What I felt was harder to name. A kind of pull. A shift in my center of gravity. Like I was no longer anchored to the life I'd been mourning. Like something else was beginning to take shape, slow and uncertain, but undeniable. I didn't know what tomorrow would look like. But I knew I couldn't go back to who I was before this weekend. And maybe, for now, that was enough. We left the lake house just after sunrise. Neither of us said much as we packed our bags and locked the door behind us. The sky was still pale and quiet, the kind of morning that felt suspended, like time itself was hesitant to move forward. He loaded my things into the trunk without a word, and I slid into the passenger seat, clutching my sweater close against the cool air. The road back felt longer than it had coming in. Trees passed in a blur of rust and gold, and I kept my eyes on the window, watching the landscape shift but not really seeing it. My mind was somewhere else, stretched thin between what had just happened and what might come next. I didn't feel guilt, exactly. It was more complicated than that. A strange mix of relief and disquiet, like I'd stepped out of something heavy but now stood exposed in the open. I wondered if he was feeling the same. He didn't play music. Didn't offer small talk or distractions. His hands gripped the wheel firmly, and his gaze stayed forward. The silence between us wasn't cold. It wasn't even tense. It was just full. Filled with things that had not yet found shape. Things we weren't ready to put into words. When we finally pulled into my driveway, the weight in my chest tightened. Home looked different now. Not physically, but in how it pressed on me. As if stepping back inside would undo everything that had shifted inside me. I wasn't sure I wanted that. He parked, turned off the engine, and looked at me for the first time since we'd left the lake. His expression was unreadable, somewhere between expectation and restraint. "I don't know what this is," I said quietly. "Or what it should be." "I'm not asking you to know," he replied. "I just didn't want to pretend it didn't matter." That landed heavier than I expected. Because I wasn't pretending. And it did matter. That was the problem. I nodded, slowly. "Thank you. For the weekend." He gave a small smile, almost tired. "Anytime." I reached for the door handle, hesitated, then stepped out. He waited until I had my bag, until I turned the key and opened the front door. Only then did I hear the engine start again. I didn't look back. The house greeted me with stillness, as always. But something felt different. The air wasn't quite as heavy. The walls didn't close in the same way. I dropped my bag by the stairs and went straight to the kitchen, where the light spilled across the floor in long, dusty beams. I stood there for a long while, my hand resting on the counter, just breathing. The rest of the day moved slowly. I unpacked, did laundry, watered the plants. All the usual motions. But I found myself pausing more than usual, catching glimpses of my reflection in windows, wondering if I looked any different. If what had shifted inside me could be seen from the outside. I didn't hear from him that day. Or the next. At first, I told myself it was good. That space was necessary. That I needed time to process everything without being pulled in deeper. But by the third day, the silence started to grow teeth. I began replaying our conversations, trying to decode every pause, every look. I wondered if he was having second thoughts, or if he regretted inviting me in the first place. Or maybe he was simply giving me space, just like I'd told myself I needed. The not knowing was worse than anything else. By the end of the week, I stopped checking my phone every hour. I silenced the notifications and busied myself with tasks that didn't require thought, polishing the silverware, reorganizing the linen closet, washing the windows. I needed order. I needed something solid to hold on to while the rest of me drifted. Then, on Saturday, my son called. His voice was bright, distracted. He told me he'd be coming into town next weekend, wanted to know if I needed anything from the city. I said no, of course. I always said no. I didn't want to be a burden. He asked how I was. I lied and said fine. After we hung up, I sat in the kitchen with the phone still in my hand, staring at the darkened screen. I hadn't told him anything. Not because I was hiding it, at least not entirely, but because I didn't know how to explain something I barely understood myself. How do you tell your child that the boundaries you spent a lifetime protecting had started to shift? That you had let someone else into the place grief had occupied for so long? That you weren't sure if it was right, but you weren't sure it was wrong either? Later that night, I went for a walk. The neighborhood was quiet. Most windows were dark, save for the occasional blue flicker of televisions behind curtains. I passed houses with porches full of pumpkins and wreaths of dried corn husks. The air smelled like leaves and wood smoke, and it stirred something deep in my chest. A longing, maybe. Or a memory. When I returned home, the porch light had come on automatically. I stood there for a moment before unlocking the door, looking up at the soft glow and wondering if he'd ever drive by again. If this house meant anything to him anymore. If I did. I went to bed with that thought lingering, curling around me like fog. And in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't loud. Just a soft, rhythmic tapping, like a branch against glass, or the tail end of a dream trying to finish its sentence. I lay there, listening, heart picking up speed for reasons I couldn't name. After a few moments, the sound stopped. Silence returned. But I couldn't fall back asleep. Because in that silence, something settled inside me. A realization, quiet but firm. I had crossed into a place where the past no longer held the same power. Where the future wasn't something I feared as much as something I didn't yet understand. And that, I knew, was the beginning of something I could never walk back from. The next few days unfolded slowly, the way late autumn days tend to move, reluctant, quiet, stretching into the early dusk with a kind of tired grace. I tried to return to normal routines, as if there was any version of normal left for me to hold on to. I went to the market, swept the porch, res-tacked the firewood. The tasks felt empty, but I clung to them. They gave shape to the hours. I hadn't heard from him. And I told myself I didn't expect to. We had shared something that lived between clarity and uncertainty, and maybe that was all it was ever meant to be. I wanted to believe I could tuck it away somewhere private, something I could carry but never act on again. But every time I passed the coat he had lent me, hanging on the hook by the door, something shifted in my chest. Then, one evening, I received a message. Not a call. Not a knock. Just a text. Are you home? I stared at it for longer than I should have. There was no punctuation. No explanation. But I knew who it was. And I knew what he meant. I didn't respond right away. I made tea, walked around the kitchen twice, folded the dish towel hanging on the stove even though it didn't need folding. My fingers trembled slightly. My breath came shallow. I wasn't scared. But I was standing at the edge of something, and I knew if I stepped forward, there would be no going back. Still, I replied. Yes. I left the front door unlocked. When he arrived, I heard the door open and close quietly. His footsteps were familiar now, and the sound of them in the hallway felt both foreign and natural, like hearing a song you used to love but hadn't listened to in years. He paused in the entrance of the living room, his eyes meeting mine. There was no need for pretense. We both knew why he was there. We didn't talk. Not really. A few words, here and there, meaningless things that tried to fill the air but never really landed. What mattered was not in what we said, but what we didn't. He stood near the fireplace. I sat on the edge of the sofa, my hands folded in my lap. There was a weight in the room, thick with history and want and restraint. We had been circling this moment for weeks, maybe longer. And now it was here, and neither of us knew how to carry it gently. He stepped forward. I stood. And then, quietly, naturally, we spent the night together. The details are not important. What mattered was the silence. The acceptance. The way neither of us asked for permission because somehow it had already been granted, not in words, but in the months of grief, glances, shared memories, and unspoken need that had brought us to this exact point. When I woke the next morning, light was leaking in through the curtains. I could hear the soft clatter of dishes in the kitchen, the kettle beginning to steam. My limbs felt heavy, not from regret, but from the weight of a choice made fully and without denial. I didn't rush to dress. I stayed in the moment, my body still, my thoughts quiet for the first time in what felt like years. There was a stillness in me, not empty, but complete. Downstairs, he poured coffee into 2 mugs without looking up. He knew I was there. "Morning," he said. I nodded. I reached for my cup. My fingers brushed his. Still, no one spoke about what had changed. Because we both understood that if we tried to define it, to shape it into something fixed, it might crumble under the weight of expectation. Later, he walked to the door, his bag slung over one shoulder. The air outside was crisp. He paused with his hand on the knob. "I don't know what this means," he said finally. I stepped closer. "Neither do I." He nodded once. A small, sad smile. "I'll call you," he said. Then he left. I didn't cry. I didn't pace the room. I didn't relive every moment or try to rearrange it in my head. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around my cup, and watched the morning unfold. I wasn't lost. But I was no longer standing where I had been. And from here, the path forward looked nothing like the road that had brought me here. After he left that morning, the quiet inside the house felt different. It wasn't the stillness of grief or loneliness, it was something else. A kind of unresolved echo. The kind of silence that follows a conversation you know isn't finished yet, but no one wants to be the first to return to it. I moved through the day with deliberate slowness. Not to delay or distract, but to give my thoughts the space they needed to settle. I folded laundry without rushing. I scrubbed the stove even though it was already clean. I changed the bedsheets, not because they needed changing, but because I couldn't bear to lie in them again without reshaping the space. Not after what had happened. There was no shame in me. But there was uncertainty. Not about what had occurred, we had both stepped into it willingly, but about what it meant, and whether it would mean anything at all in the days to come. I didn't hear from him that day. Or the next. Part of me expected that. Another part, quieter and more vulnerable, had hoped for something different. A message. A call. A sign that he was still standing in the same emotional territory as I was. But there was nothing. By the 4th day, I began to wonder if the silence was his answer. If our night together had been a release for him, a kind of closing chapter rather than an opening one. And the longer I sat with that possibility, the more it hollowed something in me I hadn't realized was still tender. I didn't chase him. I didn't text. I didn't reach out. Instead, I filled my time. I attended a neighborhood meeting about traffic near the school. I visited the local hardware store to replace a cracked porch tile. I even stopped by the florist and picked out a small arrangement for the hallway, yellow lilies and eucalyptus, something fresh to set against the faded wallpaper. But through all of that, the weight lingered. I caught myself staring at my phone more than I should have. Reading old messages, scrolling through photos, not of him, but of other days. Simpler ones. Ones where I believed I knew where I stood in the world. Then, one afternoon, while reorganizing the upstairs closet, I stumbled across a box I hadn't opened since before my husband passed. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. Some from when we first met, others written during business trips, birthdays, or simply during mundane stretches of married life. I sat on the floor for hours, reading his handwriting, hearing his voice in my head. Most of them were sweet. Thoughtful. Predictable, in the way long-term love tends to be. But a few caught me off guard, notes where he spoke honestly about his fears, his doubts, his worries that I was drifting emotionally even when we were still together. One line in particular stayed with me. Sometimes I wonder if you've already built a life in your head that doesn't include me anymore. I folded that letter slowly and held it to my chest. It was never about betrayal. Not then. Not now. But I realized something in that moment. I had been building a life without him long before he was gone. Out of necessity. Out of survival. And maybe that life had always included more silence than either of us had been willing to acknowledge. That night, I took a long walk through the neighborhood. The air was crisp, the first hints of frost clinging to parked cars. The trees were mostly bare now, their branches skeletal against the fading sky. I walked without purpose, without a destination, just following the rhythm of my own feet. At one point, I passed the house of an old friend I hadn't seen in years. Her porch light was on, the curtains drawn open. I could see her inside, reading at the kitchen table, a mug in her hands. For a brief moment, I envied her. Not because her life seemed simpler or more complete, but because it seemed settled. And I no longer knew what settled felt like. When I got home, the house welcomed me with its usual hush. I put the kettle on and sat in the kitchen, listening to the sound of water slowly climbing toward a boil. Then, without thinking too hard, I pulled out my phone and opened the conversation thread that had gone cold. I didn't write much. Just 2 words, "Are you okay?" I stared at the screen for several minutes before pressing send. Then I turned the phone over on the counter, face down, and walked away. I didn't check for a response that night. The next morning, I found his reply waiting. "I don't know." 3 words. Honest. Bare. I stood there in my robe, coffee forgotten on the counter, rereading his message over and over. It wasn't much. But it was real. And something about it gave me permission to stop waiting for clarity and instead just be present with the mess of it all. Later that day, while trimming the dead stems from the backyard bushes, I heard the gate open. I turned. He was there, hands in his pockets, unsure of whether to step forward. "I was just passing by," he said, eyes avoiding mine. "I don't believe you," I replied, wiping my gloves on my jeans. He smiled, barely. "Fair enough." He didn't stay long. We didn't touch. But before he left, he said something that stuck. "I keep thinking that if we keep waiting for the right moment, we'll miss the whole story." I didn't answer. I didn't know how to. But I thought about that sentence all day. And deep into the night. And when I finally fell asleep, I dreamed not of the past, not even of him, but of a long road with no markers, stretching ahead into something unknown. And I was walking. Alone, yes. But not afraid. Not anymore. The house had taken on a strange quiet in the days after he came to the gate. Not oppressive, not heavy like it used to be, but something more delicate, like a pause in conversation you're not sure who should break. I moved through it carefully, not because I was afraid of disturbing anything, but because I didn't want to rush whatever this was becoming. A rhythm had begun to form, one I didn't entirely understand, but I sensed it was better to let it shape itself than to try and name it too early. I no longer waited by the phone. That part had passed. It wasn't that I no longer cared, but rather that I had made peace with the uncertainty. There was something oddly freeing in surrendering to not knowing what came next. For a woman who had spent most of her life planning everything, meals, holidays, routines, conversations, that shift felt like both a loss and a relief. Then, on a quiet Thursday afternoon, the silence broke. I was upstairs sorting through an old chest of drawers, papers, photographs, receipts from forgotten years, when I heard the sound of a car door closing. A familiar cadence. I didn't rush to the window. I didn't smooth my hair or change my clothes. I finished folding the letter I'd been reading and placed it back where it belonged. By the time I reached the door, he was standing on the porch, hands in his jacket pockets, that same tentative look in his eyes. As though he wasn't sure if I would open it. As though he wasn't sure if he should have come at all. I opened it. "Hi," he said. I stepped aside to let him in. He brushed past me quietly, his presence no longer foreign in this space. He didn't carry anything. Didn't wear that charming confidence he often led with. Instead, he looked tired. Like someone who'd been carrying too much for too long. We sat in the kitchen. I poured us both coffee, and we drank it slowly. The way people do when the conversation isn't about the drink, but about everything that surrounds it. He told me he'd been away for a few days. Driving. Visiting places he hadn't seen since he was younger. Trying to make sense of things, he said. I nodded. I knew that feeling all too well. I didn't press him. I didn't ask for clarity or promises. I simply listened. Eventually, the subject turned to my son. I told him about the call, about how he'd be visiting soon. I watched his face carefully, searching for any shift. There was something unreadable there, something just beneath the surface. I'm glad, he said. You should see him. There was a pause. Then, does he know anything? I shook my head. No. And I'm not sure he ever will. He nodded once, slowly. Probably for the best. There was a weight in that agreement. A kind of mutual understanding that what had happened between us existed in a space that might never be shared openly. Not because it was shameful, but because it was fragile. Too fragile to survive the scrutiny of explanation. After a while, he stood and walked toward the window, hands clasped behind his back. I keep thinking about the lake, he said. About how quiet it was. It's always quiet there, I said. Not like that. He turned to face me, and in his expression, I saw something that startled me, not desire, not confusion, but something closer to loss. As though he knew he had already begun to step away from something, even as he stood in front of it. I think I've made a mistake, he said quietly. I didn't speak. He looked at me like he wanted me to respond, to tell him he hadn't, to pull him back into the safety of what we'd shared. But I couldn't. Because the truth was, I didn't know either. Not that night, he clarified. That night was real. I don't know if I'm the person you need me to be. I wanted to tell him I didn't need him to be anything. That I wasn't looking for definition, for structure, for the comfort of being someone's something again. But that would have been a lie. Because part of me had begun to hope. Quietly, gently. Hope had crept in through the cracks, and now it sat heavy in my chest, uninvited but undeniable. I walked to the sink, poured out the cold remains of my coffee, and said, maybe I'm not ready either. It was the most honest thing I'd said in weeks. He stood there for a long time. Then he walked over to the door, his movements slow, thoughtful. Before leaving, he paused, hand on the frame. I think about you more than I should, he said. I met his gaze. So do I. He nodded. Then he stepped outside and closed the door behind him. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't sit by the window, waiting for the headlights to return. Instead, I took a long bath, lit a candle, and lay in bed with a book I barely read. My mind wasn't calm, but it wasn't spinning either. It was hovering between two possible futures, neither of which I could fully see. The next morning, I woke early and went to the back garden. The frost had hardened the soil, but I still knelt down and began to prune the last of the wilted stems. It was a ritual. A kind of preparation. Clearing out what could no longer bloom to make space for what might. When I returned inside, there was a message on my phone. From him. It said only this: I'm sorry I'm not better at this. But I meant it. All of it. Asterisk. I read it twice. Then I put the phone down. I didn't respond. Not yet. Because some words aren't meant to be answered right away. Some words are seeds. And they need time, and silence, and space to decide if they'll take root. There's a certain relief in endings, even the ones you don't choose. For a long time, I was terrified of finality. I saw it everywhere after my husband died, in empty drawers, in closed doors, in the absence of footsteps that used to echo down the hall. But as the days shortened and the first snow began to threaten the forecast, I found myself less afraid of things ending, and more curious about what might begin. My son arrived on a Saturday, as promised, arms full of groceries and stories from the city. He moved through the house with a kind of easy energy that always amazed me, his presence filling the room so completely that for a few hours I could almost forget how quiet my life had become. We made dinner together, chopped onions side by side, laughed about old holiday disasters. He didn't ask about my mood or the tiredness that sometimes lingered behind my smiles. He didn't need to. He watched, quietly, with that particular concern children have for parents they suddenly see as vulnerable. In the evening, we sat in the living room with the old photo albums. He wanted to hear stories about his father, the mischievous ones, the ones he was too young to remember. I found myself telling the truth in small, safe doses, letting memory do its work, neither embellishing nor erasing. I could feel my son watching me, searching for signs of something he couldn't quite name. Grief, maybe. Or the shadow of something new. Later, when he'd gone to bed, I lingered downstairs. The house, for once, didn't feel empty. I made tea and sat in the kitchen, the steam swirling in the yellow lamplight. My phone sat on the table, silent. I hadn't responded to his last message, and I still didn't know if I would. I wanted to believe there was a way forward that wouldn't require me to choose between loyalty and longing, between past and future, but I was beginning to accept that most of life's roads split whether you want them to or not. The next morning, I woke early. Snow had fallen in the night, dusting the garden in white. I stood at the window for a long time, watching the pale light creep across the yard. I felt different, not fixed or healed, but lighter. As if I'd finally let go of something I'd carried for too long. When my son left, I hugged him longer than usual. He didn't comment, just squeezed back with the gentle strength I remembered from when he was small. As his car disappeared down the street, the silence that followed felt less like an absence and more like a clearing. I spent the next hours tidying, moving slowly from room to room. I changed the sheets on the guest bed, wiped fingerprints from the fridge, watered the plants. Each act was a small ritual, a way of reclaiming space. A way of deciding what I wanted to bring forward, and what I was finally ready to leave behind. In the afternoon, I opened the closet and took out the old box of letters again. I read them all, every last one. Some made me cry. Some made me laugh. Some made me long for a time I couldn't get back. But none of them made me wish I'd done things differently. Not anymore. At dusk, I sat at my desk and opened a blank sheet of paper. For the first time in a long time, I wrote, not to my husband, not to my son, not even to the man who had so recently changed the shape of my days. I wrote to myself. I wrote about hope, about fear, about the strangeness of moving forward when you don't know where forward leads. I wrote until my hand cramped and my eyes blurred with fatigue. Then, and only then, did I pick up my phone. I didn't write much. Just 2 words. Thank you. No name. No explanation. Just gratitude for what had been, and for what would come next, whatever that might be. That night, as I lay in bed, I listened to the wind outside, soft against the glass. I didn't think about what I'd lost, or even what I might have gained. I thought about beginnings. About the quiet, persistent possibility that lives inside every ending. And for the first time, I let myself rest.